This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
The real power in having some of these conversations about your own death is the ability to identify any relationships that you need to reconcile. And whether they be people who have passed on or whether they're here, present, there is a way of really clearing the air and gaining peace from those, whether you can reconcile them in 3 dimensions in real life or whether you're reconciling them just in your heart.
This is the Heart of Hospice podcast with Helen Bauer. My guest today is Sarah Cavenaugh, host of A Peaceful Exit podcast, and we're talking about death. Whether you were a family caregiver or an end-of-life professional, the Heart of Hospice is here to enhance your hospice experience by connecting you with information you can use about end-of-life care.
This episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast is sponsored by the Tree of Life Conference by International Doula Life Movement. Join IDLM at the Tree of Life Conference in San Antonio, Texas, November 1st through the 4th. The Tree of Life Conference is more than just workshops and seminars. It's an opportunity to connect, learn, and renew your commitment to compassionate care. Attendees will hear from expert speakers like end-of-life educator Barbara Carnes and Death Deck co-creator Lisa Paul. Visit internationaldoulalifemovement.com for more details. This episode is sponsored by Hospice Navigation Services. When you need information about hospice, Hospice Navigation Services can help. Our team of experienced hospice navigators is here to offer one-on-one consulting sessions by phone or video. You can book a complimentary 30-minute session when you need general information, or book a 60-minute session when you have in-depth questions or need to troubleshoot your current hospice care. It's your journey. Hospice Navigation Services can be your guide. Visit theheartofhospice.com to schedule your hospice navigation session today.
My guest today is a podcaster's dream. Sarah Cavenaugh is the founder of Peaceful Exit, a company that explores all aspects of grief and loss, and she's also the host of Peaceful Exit podcast. It's a show that explores life, death, and grief. She's talking with authors who have written extensively on the topic to help us all normalize death as part of the human experience, no matter who we are, no matter our politics, spiritual faith, or socioeconomic status. Sarah has led startups in the social sector for over 30 years, working in support of the arts, environmental justice, children's health, and human rights. She also co-designed a curriculum to open the conversation around the physical, psychological, and spiritual aspects of death and dying. Peaceful Exit also explores how to radically accept our eventual demise, how to talk about it, and even plan for it. But it's not all doom and gloom. There's joy, meaning, and connection to be found in exploring the messiness of death, dying, and grief. You can connect with Sarah at peacefulexit.net and listen to the Peaceful Exit podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Sarah has an interesting hobby, scuba diving, which I think is interesting because she talks about that in relation to her death. You're going to hear her mention that and bring it up. Her mission at the Peaceful Exit podcast is to encourage conversations around death and dying. She interviews authors who have written books around that particular topic. She sees grief not as an emotion, but as an experience. And I think a great description that she used was the color wheel of a grief experience. You get all these different grief emotions, and each one of them has a different color. I like to think of it as like the paint sample wheel that you get that has all the different colors and shades. You're going to hear Sarah and I share our memories of people, the things we remember about them, and the deep conversations she's had with some of the guests on her show. She says talking about death is really talking about life. So profound and so real and so true. She also describes the concept of emotional legacy, and you're going to hear her give a more detailed explanation of that. It's a great conversation. So sit back, get your cup of tea, your cup of coffee, and here's my conversation with Sarah Cavenaugh of the Peaceful Exit podcast. Sarah, welcome to the Heart of Hospice podcast. It's so great to have you on the show.
Well, thank you, Helen. It's such an honor to be here.
I love talking to other podcasters. It's so easy.
Well, I hope so. I hope this one's easy.
Oh, it definitely will be. But I'm going to start with an icebreaker question that I didn't send you in advance. This is a little bit of a cheaty thing. Just so I can get to know you a little bit and our listeners can get to know you too. If you could only have one color of clothing in your wardrobe, what color would it be?
Cobalt blue.
Oh, why cobalt blue?
Well, I think it was during COVID that we all shifted to Zoom. And Zoom, I have to thank whoever invented this video technology, because I think when we were all locked down, the ability to check in with people and see their faces and their expressions, especially my dear friends across the country, I discovered blue was a great color on Zoom, and I discovered that I had always loved bright colors, and particularly cobalt. And if you can't see my computer screen right now, but it's that color, the entire screen. There's no photograph there. And if I click off of my visual here, generally, not on this laptop, but on other computers, I have a blue sea image with a large jellyfish. That's my headshot.
Oh, I like it. I like it. Blue is my favorite color too, as you can see. I have a navy blue wall right behind me.
It's a power color.
It definitely is, but it also says trust and I'm an expert and it's friendly. At least that's the way I feel about blue. That's the vibe I get from it.
I'm also a scuba diver, so I love blue.
Oh, that's totally appropriate then. It's very, very much speaks for your person, your personality. I like that. Well, we're talking about the fun stuff and some of the superficial stuff. We're getting ready to dive into it now. No scuba diving, pun intended, but that was really good, right?
That was great.
Thank you.
Keep them coming.
That's probably the only one I've got. You are in a different kind of business, educating people about death and the conversations surrounding it. How in the world did you get started in a business like that?
Well, I think this conversation chose me. I think throughout my career, I've been looking for a conversation that crosses difference. And there's one thing that we all share, and that is our mortality. And I love people's stories, and I'm super curious. And I remember when a friend leaned over, she was about 82 at the time, and she leaned over to me and said, "I still working full time, and I don't have a plan. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm 82. What am I going to do for the end of my life?" And I just said, "Well, let's figure it out." And in the process of figuring that out with 7 incredible women who we all just kind of dug into what are the beautiful questions that we need to ask ourselves about the end of our lives, I started to realize that I was sort of born for this. My mother died about 21 years ago, and she didn't really get anything she wanted at the end of her life. She loved her garden. She loved her grandchildren. She ended up in a phase 1 trial. She was scooped up in the cancer sort of treatment machine. And what I was really struck by is that we never had a conversation about her dying. And we never had a conversation about what she wanted in her last weeks, because it was a stage 4 diagnosis. And her death was imminent, and yet we were all in denial and none of us talked about it. And then further back, I went to my birth, which I was actually born because my brother died and they wanted 4 children. And so they had another baby. They had me. And so the family was grieving when I was born, and we never talked about it. I didn't even know I had a brother until I was 10 years old. And
Wow.
then my oldest brother, we were at I think my grandfather's funeral, and he said, let's go visit Matthew's grave. And I said, who's Matthew? And it turns out that there was a baby before me that had died, and that my family had just moved on and moved forward and hadn't really processed that grief. And so I realized that this is the conversation that I was born to have. And we all live in the conversations we have about our lives. And I believe that this might be one of the most important conversations that you are having, and you're doing such a beautiful job in your podcast, having these conversations and giving people real, tangible information that, the broader culture, we just want to stay young forever and avoid death at all costs,
Right.
So I started Peaceful Exit to help people to have these really important conversations and normalize this conversation about death.
Wow. Well, thank you for the kind words about the work that I'm doing. And I love the meaning that you're making from your personal experiences. So with your awareness as a kid that there was a family member that had died, a child that had died, did you have any awareness as a younger person growing up that those conversations were important?
No, I really didn't. I think that I was raised in sort of this culture of affirmations. You think positive, you can change your thoughts, you can change your life.
Right.
Which is not a bad thing at all. Although I think it sort of subdues some of these harder emotions, and those were not as welcome in the conversation. So there wasn't a full range. If you look at the color wheel of emotion, we had a very small slice of the pie growing up. And I think it's interesting because it's just occurring to me that I think a lot of this next generation that's involved in social media and sort of presenting this really positive life, positive, happy face when there might be a lot going on actually in their lives that's not being represented. It feels a little bit like that. This is way before computers and social media, but there's a certain reputation to uphold. And now that we have social media, again, there's this, tendency to put out what's really positive or, make sure your hair's done or whatever. I don't know.
Right.
As I said before, not sophisticated on social media. But it's sort of the same thing, like, preserve the reputation of a life that, from the outside should be a very, very, very happy childhood, right?
Yeah.
And I was not aware. I was not aware as a child at the impact of holding back. And when you hold back one emotion, all emotions are muted. You can't just select one of them.
When you think about the face, right? Because we put the face on, the social media face.
Yes,
It's the Christmas letter face. And
Yes.
the Christmas letter doesn't say, well, this year was really big for us. So-and-so went to college. Our other kid got engaged. And my mom and I started having these awesome conversations about the end of her life. That doesn't go on to the Christmas letter.
Oh, I think it might go on to my Christmas letter.
Yes, absolutely.
And maybe yours too.
Maybe so. So maybe my Christmas letter would look like that. That's pretty funny. But most people don't say that. And they definitely don't say, well, this year we continued to grieve the loss of our kid. Or, my mom's death still haunts me. That's not the face we put forward.
Well, maybe you and I can start a new tradition.
And I think we are with these conversations that we're having. And I do see an uptick. And it's probably because I'm connected with people who are speaking in the death positive world. But there's an uptick in talking about grief. And I think the pandemic was a catalyst for that. because,
I agree.
we were grieving so many different things that didn't have anything to do with death, but loss of community because we couldn't gather, loss of ritual, loss of traditions, because no holidays, no funeral gatherings, things like that. A change of our identities, the sense of safety that we had inside our own country and in our own community groups where people were so divided about how we were handling things. And so I think grief became a global conversation for sure, but definitely elevated in the United States.
I agree. And I've often wondered if it's the algorithm that's throwing me all of these grief conversations or, because
Right.
I'm very hopeful that you and I are part of a bigger movement to really talk about grief and talk about death. And once we embrace our mortality and have a better idea of what it looks like to be mortal, then we can live full out and every day feel really grateful that we're still alive.
Isn't that the biggest misconception that people have, that talking about grief and death and dying is nothing but sad? Because I have wonderful, funny, warm, sometimes very heartbreaking, but hilarious and wise conversations with all these people working in death care.
It's absolutely the best. And I'll tell you, part of my learning was actually in West Africa. I went to Liberia, and they are a people who have seen a lot of death. And they are the most joyful people. I met a woman named Grace who came up to me, and she was lit from inside. I have never seen anyone full of so much joy. And she had been severely mistreated. And I don't know how much I can say in your podcast, but
you can say anything you want to.
Well, I'll tell you that I'm another job, another business. I'm a documentary film producer, and a very dear friend of mine was doing a documentary in Liberia, and her main character, whose name was Gladys, was held as a sex slave for 12 years. And she was an incredible human being, and I think meeting her changed my life. I met Gladys at the hotel in Monrovia, and she was lit from inside. She was so joyful. She was still at risk because her captor was now in the parliament, I think. Or I don't know if it's a parliament, to be honest. Their government structure. A lot of the warlords during their civil war were actually put in politics, ended up in politics. And what it makes me think about in relation to our conversation is it really struck me how people who have been through such trauma can also feel such joy. And it's almost like the depth of your pain and fear opens up this whole universe of joy and contentment and gratitude for every single day. So I often talk about this because in this culture, because we try and stay young forever and we try to avoid dying with medicines that we may not need, we think talking about death is depressing and a bummer and
Right.
it'll be and gross. Like, who wants to talk about this? And it's some of the funniest, most loving conversations I've ever had with people. Full stop.
Yeah. And, as a hospice nurse, I've had people say, oh, that must be so depressing. Actually, it's not.
Mm-mm.
To be witness and present, to sit with people, to support them, to see needs that I can't meet, people who are so sick, that I really have to dig in deeply to find a skill and an intervention that's appropriate to alleviate any of the suffering. It's an incredible privilege and an honor, and I have learned way more than I've ever taught, and I've been educating people for the last 15 years, whether at the bedside or my peers, but I've learned way more than I ever taught with these conversations. And I think it's interesting what you're saying about this person who had experienced such terrible suffering, and yet the capacity for joy swung all the way out to the furthest end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
So I think that death provides those same opportunities.
That's right.
Yes, there's so much suffering and sadness attached to it. Grief is sad. I mean, we're never going to spin it and say, hey, they're in a better place, which is one of the most horrible phrases anybody could ever use, right? Horrible. Don't ever say that to me. If I lose somebody, I will probably slap the crap out of anybody that says that to me. There's space for the both and. I had a guest named Lisa Kefauver. She's the host of the Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. And she says you have to think about the both and. There is space for joy and sadness in a grief event. Yeah.
Well, I don't think of grief as an emotion. I think grief as an experience. And so when I mentioned the color wheel earlier, every emotion in that color wheel is part of grief. And it's an experience that one has throughout one's life. And it's not that I got over my mother's passing. I'll never get over it. But I experience grief for her in all different ways, which includes really funny moments. And she used to make waffles. And so sometimes when I smell waffles, I think about her, And so grief all encompasses all of that. It's not just sadness. And I think this, unfortunately, I think a lot of people think, oh, it's just sadness and wearing black and, being bummed out.
Right. But so when you think about that, your mother's been gone, 21 years, you said?
21 years.
So my grandmother died about the same time, about 21 years ago. And I still have moments when I make fudge for my kids. And I have to tell you, I'm not a cook, but this recipe was something my grandmother would make with me when I was a kid. Sometimes you pour it out and you can cut it with a knife and everything. Sometimes you eat it with a spoon because it's not always right. So when I make it and it turns out badly and I'm using a spoon, standing there in the kitchen going, this was really not how this was supposed to turn out, I talk to my grandmother and I'll say, we never really did perfect this recipe, but it's still good, isn't it? And there's so much joy in feeling that connection to her.
I agree. I still have my mother's joy of cooking with all the writing in it,
Oh, yeah? Yeah?
Yeah, I don't use that cookbook, but maybe once in a blue moon I'll make their banana bread or something. But
it's the one that's got all the splatters on it from where it was sitting on the counter. Yeah.
And a whole section pulls out, like it's like breaking. The binding is breaking.
Mm-hmm.
And
sure.
Oh, yeah.
That's the best kind of cookbook. Well loved.
Yeah. Very well loved.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. We're going to pause for just a minute. My guest has more to share.
In a world where compassion and community are needed more than ever, the International Doula Life Movement presents the Tree of Life Conference. Join IDLM November 1st through the 4th in San Antonio, Texas for an extraordinary experience in end-of-life care. The Tree of Life Conference is not just an event, it's a movement towards making a positive impact. Attendees will hear from expert speakers including award-winning end-of-life educator Barbara Carnes, Lisa Paul of The Death Deck, Brenda Kazire and Nancy Hireman of Odonata Care, and end-of-life advocate Helen Bauer, host of the Heart of Hospice podcast. The Tree of Life Conference is more than just workshops and seminars. It's an opportunity to connect, learn, and renew your commitment to compassionate care. This event is made possible by the team at International Doula Life Movement, who believes in the power of empathy, education, and making a difference in the world. Don't miss out on this transformative experience. Join IDLM at the Tree of Life Conference in San Antonio, Texas from November 1st through the 4th. Visit internationaldoulalifemovement.com for more details and secure your spot today.
On your podcast, on the Peaceful Exit podcast, what kind of topics do you like to focus on?
Well, that's a great question. I began these conversations with writers. It blends my love of language and authors and artists, and I wanted to share their words with the world because I believe they're in a unique place in their grief because they have really thought deeply about what happened and sort of the ripple effect of what happened. They're articulating grief in a way that I think is instructive for all of us. It enlightens us. Grief never goes away, and we can learn to live with it. But what does that look like? How do you articulate something that's inexpressible? And I say in the opening of my podcast, writers are our translators, and I believe that to be true. I talk to authors about living well, like Dr. Keltner, who wrote the book Awe, and Everyday Awe, and how that got him through the loss of his brother. I talk about gratitude. Christy Nelson used to run the Network for Grateful Living. Revolutionary Love with Valerie Kaur, and how the brain works. Even like Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor talks about how that your brain functions and how grief lives in your amygdala. And she lost her mother, which was a very compelling conversation. Every one of us has loss, and every one of us. Not everyone can talk about it. Not everyone can talk about their loss in a way that's instructive and enlightening to others. But I truly believe that the writers who have really grappled with it are able to talk about it in a way that's really, really heartwarming. I believe talking about death is talking about life. And creating a language around these death conversations allows us to get past that fear. And one of the book authors I interviewed, Dr. Sheldon Solomon, he wrote The Worm at the Core. And he studied for like decades the fear of death and how it's caused some of the more tragic things in our world. Because as individuals, if we're afraid of death, we're going to hoard things. We're going to commit violent acts on other people and animals and nature. And, you know, this whole thing about really facing that fear of death and unpacking it and becoming much more at peace with the fact that we're mortal, which is why it's called Peaceful Exit. Because if we can come to a place of peace around our temporary time on this earth, then we're going to live into such a beautiful future. And that's where I want a utopian future. I don't want a dystopian future.
So sometimes when I read a writer who's talking about a death event, a loss, you know, something that's very personal for them, I think, man, this is exactly what I feel about a particular loss in my own life. But this person was able to express it. And that must be so cathartic and therapeutic. It doesn't undo anything for them.
Right.
But for me to read it and to feel change or acceptance or awareness of what this might be like, there are certain things that resonate, especially if it seems relevant when you identify it with it. So my mom is 91, and she has neither Alzheimer's nor dementia. She basically has senile degeneration of the brain, which is just natural aging. And it presents for her with a deficit in logical thinking and problem solving and memory deficit as well. And I remember seeing the movie Still Alice with Julianne Moore and having this click in of identifying with that situation. So when you read content from an author, don't we all have some sort of little click of revelation that this is me? This will be me. It won't be my story because everybody's story is a little bit different. But this is about what I'm going to have. This is a relevant event. I identify with that.
Absolutely. And I also think an author can serve as an expanded story. So if you listen to my conversation with Rebecca Wolf, for example, Rebecca Wolf wrote a book called All of This. And she and her husband were estranged. They were about to get a divorce. And her husband was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. So she stuck around to care for him at the end of his life. But the way she embraced death she has 4 children. With her children, they buried him. They danced to Prince on the grave. They kept they kept bones from the cremation in their home. They talk about him all the time. They drive by and they have Dead Dad Day where they go visit him.
Oh, really? That's awesome.
Yeah. So it serves as a beautiful example of someone who's wide open about death so that we can not feel quite so shy about stepping into even a little bit. You know what I mean? So if you're completely shut down in this conversation and you hear a story like that, and you're like, oh man, I could never do that. I could, but I could do this. I could do this small thing. I could have this conversation with my kid, for example.
Yeah. Maybe I don't want to do all of that. That's
I
not
don't
me.
want to do all of that. That's not me. So it's almost like, yes, I agree with you. It's also like I can recognize myself in a book, and I can also not recognize myself, but differentiate by having a different conversation.
Right. Because the story you write for yourself is going to be different. It's unique. So I find when I talk to authors on the show, or when I read books about people that have had unique, what I would consider unique, right? Everybody's story is its own unicorn. I learned so much, and I think it opens up even my perceptions about death conversations and how people approach end-of-life care. So, for instance, I had a guest on, Robert Party, who is this amazing guy. His wife, who was a physician, oddly enough, was diagnosed with an advanced cancer, and they chose to handle her care very differently. She didn't want to know anything. She wanted him to make all the decisions. And at first glance, as a female, I was like, well, what in the hell is she doing? She didn't want to know anything, and she wanted him to just manage, turn it over. My feminism, Gloria Steinem's head is spinning around. How could she do that? And by the time he finished talking about the story, the only impression I had, the wisdom I had was, man, she handled this just the way she wanted. She did it her style, no compromise. They fired a doctor who tried to push in with information during an appointment. And she's like, no, we're done. If he can't follow what I want, my rules about how this care is going to go, then we're just going to use someone else. And I remember thinking, that's crazy, until I realized it wasn't. It was incredible. And she did it her way.
I love that. That's exactly why I want to have these conversations and coach people individually. Like, what do you want? What do you want at the end of your life? And I think that's really important for women, especially. They often outlive their partners if their partner is male, and just are, you can just look in our assisted living homes and
predominantly female. True.
And it's really important to have these conversations.
And I think we need to be really good at listening to other people's conversation when they want to have it. There's so many folks in the baby boomer group that are choosing to age by themselves. We call them solo agers. It's a label I don't like using, but I think it communicates, right? We have folks that are living out the end of their lives either by choice or just by circumstance according to their family relationships. So when we are asked to be the memory keepers and the information keepers and the listeners for these end-of-life conversations. We need to listen. Not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, I agree. And I'd also just offer my friend Anne's, who's now 78, her term is wise-ager.
Wise-ager?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That sounds a little bit like wise ass.
That's
in
all
a
right.
way.
She would love that you said that, actually.
Yes. And I am one of those people. I'm a smart mouth. That's what kind of made me think about it, because my mother was constantly telling me I was a smart aleck. So what exactly does that term mean?
She feels a little bit like returning to the sort of creative, generative, amazing time of being a teenager, but with a lot more wisdom and years under her belt. She has a wonderful definition. I don't have it in front of me, but she wanted a new term. She didn't want to be put in a box. And she actually lives in a co-op with all generations. You know, there are apartments or condos, I guess, with so multi-generational living situations. You know, she's really conscious of the way we treat our elders and, you know, trying to shift that, you know, how we live, how we take care of each other. She's divorced and no biological children, and so she's had to figure it out. And one of the inspirations for part of our online course with Peaceful Exit is this group she started. Because she has no immediate family, she created a pod of close friends who are going to take care of her at the end of her life. And we all have jobs. I'm actually the understudy because I joined the pod a little late in the game. So I'll do whatever job, you know, if someone can't do their, you know, primary job, I'm the understudy. So
I love the multi-generational thing. Because we're not just having these conversations, or we shouldn't be just having these conversations, you know, me talking to my husband, we're the same age. There's a good chance he's not going to be my decision maker. It will be one of my children. So if I have meaningful conversations with my children, and not just the legal, financial, you know, final disposition, not just the nuts and bolts of things, but my legacy and my ethical will, what do I wish for them? You know, what do I dream for them? Then they are in turn hopefully going to be more comfortable, not just in the experience of my death, but in their own conversations with their own kids.
yeah, one of the things I learned in the conversations I'm having is this concept of emotional legacy and the importance of making sure you articulate what you want at the end of your life so that you don't leave the emotional legacy of, you know, your children arguing over stuff or, you know, the real pain in the ass of probate or the, you know, this or that, because the memories you want them to have of you are a celebration.
Yeah.
You know, and the wonderful things you did in your life, like creating this Heart of Hospice podcast.
And I love doing this. For me, it has become a labor of love to have these conversations. And when I get one person, even just one person that reaches out and says, wow, I went to the resource that you recommended, or I had this experience where I remembered a conversation you had on the podcast. That's a huge legacy. And if that's what I get to leave, that's amazing.
Yeah. Something happened to me recently where my husband actually took his mother is 87, my mother-in-law, and they hadn't really had a lot of conversations about her death. And so they took one of the episodes of the podcast and they listened to it together and then had a conversation, and it's all worth it.
Oh, that's so cool.
And you know, like you hear from one person who heard something that sparked a conversation or that moved them in some way, it's all worth it.
I know. Isn't that funny? You could do 100 episodes, and if you have one person reach out to you, it just means the world.
Yeah, it does.
I am loving this conversation, but we're going to take a break right now. There's more to come.
When you need information about hospice for yourself or someone you care about, Hospice Navigation Services can help you navigate hospice care for the best end-of-life experience possible. If you're walking this journey and need the help of an experienced guide, Hospice Navigation Services is here for you. We understand the importance of having a guide who can provide personalized, unbiased support. Our team of experienced hospice navigators is here to offer one-on-one consulting sessions by phone or video. Whether you need information about how to start hospice services or guidance for your current services, we're here to listen and provide compassionate support every step of the way. You can book a 30-minute free navigation session with an experienced hospice navigator when you need general information to start your hospice experience. Book a 60-minute hospice navigation session when you have in-depth questions about hospice or need to troubleshoot your current hospice care. You deserve compassionate support and guidance for your end-of-life care. It's your journey. Hospice Navigation Services can be your guide. Visit theheartofhospice.com to schedule your hospice navigation session today.
Sarah, tell me about a guest you've had on the show that told you a story that moved you deeply.
Well, given our conversation, I'm sure you understand this too. Every author moves me in some way. Every conversation moves me in some way. If the book was published 30 years ago or yesterday, I think, what I find you to be is a very present podcaster. And when you're present in the conversation, you can't help but be moved by these stories, right? There's so many gifted caregivers. One of the more recent releases was Lynn Twist about death and money, but she shares toward the end of the conversation about a couple who decided to die together, and they arranged the timing. They saved up some medications over a year or so. They had the date.
Oh, wow.
They knew what they were doing. They had a beautiful meal with their family beforehand. It was really moving. I had someone call me right after it was released, and they listened to it and were in tears because it's a beautiful story. Adam Robarts talks about his family caring for their son who died at age 19, and how this was during COVID. And so they had to learn how to nurse their son in isolation because no one would come, and how they learned how to take care of him at the end of his life. Really beautiful. Another one was Anita Sanchez, who she talks about her father. She lost her father when she was young, but he was also her abuser. So there's this dialectic between loving and losing your father, but also a relief in losing the person that was mistreating you. And she talks about the indigenous wisdom of forgiving the unforgivable. And I think that's one thing you and I haven't talked about, is the real power in having some of these conversations about your own death is the ability to identify any relationships that you need to reconcile. And whether they be people who have passed on or whether they're here present, there is a way of really clearing the air and gaining peace from those, whether you can reconcile them in 3 dimensions in real life, or whether you're reconciling them just in your heart. And that piece of this is the deeper conversation that we're having in Peaceful Exit, when we get together, these small cohorts, and talk about how do we die without leaving behind things unsaid. So we're talking about death, but we're talking about our lives and what relationships might need some clearing, if you will. And I think so many of my guests have really moved me, and I'm sure you know this too. You just learn a ton from talking to people and how they approach their own mortality and how they approach grief, and a wide range from, dancing on a grave to, in my case, not talking about it at all.
Right.
It's like mom dies on Friday, which was May 10th. Mother's Day was Sunday. We spread our ashes on Mother's Day. I went into labor with our third child, had the baby, and life went on.
Oh, wow. And it's there. It's amazing that you can talk to all of these people doing this work for so long, being an educator and a teacher, doing the podcasting, and yet you can still be touched and moved by the stories. There's an incredible well of space for the beauty and the depth of these stories. Maybe that's the key to longevity and the fact that we don't find this work in these conversations depressing.
Say more about that.
Just to be able to have this openness and space that changes shape. I can fit in your story. I had an interview with a woman that I did who lost a 19-year-old son, and they did not embrace hospice. He had been ill with a genetic disorder his entire life, and she talked about his death 10 years before. 10 years before. And she and I both cried.
Mm.
And I had space for that. I could be moved by that. And I've been at the bedside with so many people. And yet I can sit and make space and see the beauty and feel the pain for what she's doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a gift to be able to receive people's stories, is what I think.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
So the pandemic changed who we were. I think it changed our conversations. It elevated them. I think it changed the nature of the people that were having the conversations. It definitely brought grief to the forefront, right? We knew as a nation that we were grieving all sorts of things. Have you noticed that our conversations around death and dying have changed through the years?
It's certainly changed for me. I went from not having any language around this subject matter, now to, I can't stop talking about it.
I'm the same way.
You can be a real buzzkill at parties.
Oh, yeah. Tell somebody says, what do you do for a living? Oh, I'm a hospice nurse. I work with people who are dying. It just sucks the air right out of the room.
Yeah. Unless, it's interesting because it's really sparked a lot of conversations. Recently, I was on an airplane to New York, and I sat next to a woman. That's all she wanted to talk about. Her mother just turned 100, and she found out what I'm doing, and we just talked the entire way. It's a 5.5-hour flight, so it was wonderful. I feel like I have entered an algorithm of grief and death conversations, and I'm not sure if it's the computer sending me all of these things or whether the culture has completely shifted. My guess is a little bit of both. I think I'm in a constant learning phase. The more I learn, the less I know, and that's why everyone's story is fascinating and moving to me, because I don't come from, this is not what I come from. I don't come from this conversation. I'm coming into it with such insatiable curiosity, and I could talk to you for 3 hours about hospice, and I would love that. But I do think the culture's changing, and you're right. COVID really opened up more conversations about not only grief, but also mental health. And I think both of these conversations are so important right now when people are experiencing so much coming at us, all of us, right?
Right.
And the mental health epidemic. It's so important that we have these conversations and we're open about our own experiences. I'm not the expert, and you have a lot more training than I do, But I am a conversationalist, and I'm a storyteller, I'm a documentarian, and what I see is happening is a need for conversations around peace in the world, and this conversation leads to individual peace, and I believe it will lead to people understanding difference and not canceling it or turning away from it. We have to see a different news hour because we're just being bombarded. We have to approach money differently, and the fear of death is like hoarding wealth and resources. If we can address that fear, we'll have a more equitable world. And I saw a commercial the other day that was all about fear and creating fear of the other. And I think that, when you're at the bedside of someone who's dying, none of that matters. None of it matters.
No.
Doesn't matter your politics. It doesn't matter what you believe in, your spiritual beliefs. If you can honor people's spiritual beliefs at the end of their life, it's the most beautiful moment. Yeah.
I love that. Now I'm going to get super, super personal. And you remember, set the boundaries on this. In your own advanced care planning, your own advanced care plan conversations that you've had, what are some of the unique or special things that you've talked about for your end of life?
It's interesting. I don't know that they're unique. What I'm challenged with right now is my dementia care plan. And my father has dementia. And I'm in this conversation and inquiry around quality of life. Because he has 24-hour care, a strong heart, strong human. But is that a quality of life if you don't recognize the people you love, and if you aren't able to participate in activities that you once did? And so I think I love your question. And I could answer it in a few ways. I could answer it sort of like, I don't want people to wear black. They should wear color, and they should be celebrating and dancing and not, and all of the emotions, the entire color wheel. I can do that. I could answer that way. But what I'm really wrestling with this dementia care piece, and what's the tipping point? At which point, I might go scuba diving with a small tank or something.
Yeah. Where does quality of life stop and start?
Exactly.
Right.
And it's different for everyone.
Well, and who gets to decide quality of life for you?
It's a great question. And I'm really exploring that.
Yeah. And how would you look at somebody else's life, your father's life, on the outside and say there's no quality there?
So what have you thought about dementia?
So this is an interesting question for me as well, with my mother's health decline. And even though she doesn't have dementia, not every 91-year-old has mental degeneration, degeneration of the brain like that. And I see coping mechanisms that she has employed, allowing her life to become smaller and smaller, social groups. And I see what I don't want for myself. I also see families that grieve so drastically to watch this kind of decline in a loved one. And more than anything, I think in my advanced care planning, I want whatever is going to be comfortable and safe and comforting for my kids. So like you're saying, you can say, I want everybody to wear colors to my funeral, that kind of thing. Or I want a certain type of music. Say, for instance, a lot of people will say, I want you to play this particular music because it's very meaningful to me. I don't give a rat's behind, personally, what kind of music you play at my funeral, because I don't plan to be there. But for my daughters, if I said, okay, I want you to play the traditional hymns that I grew up with, going to church with my grandmother, etc., and they were like, we haven't listened to that music in 40 years. That does not bring us any comfort. It has no meaning for us. Then don't play it.
Yeah.
Yeah, play what has meaning for you. So I think when I think about the dementia piece of things, I would have to look at family relationships. Can I interact with you? Can you keep me safe without ruining yourself financially? or physically, through fatigue and caregiving responsibilities. And so I would put my quality of life line somewhere in there. But it would be about, if I'm not aware of any of it, how is it affecting the people that are taking care of me? How does it affect my children?
Yeah, wonderful answer.
Yeah. But a very complicated one. And I think
it is very complicated.
Yeah, hard to define.
Yeah, and even my siblings and I disagree on when he checks out or he's present. Like what was the quality of the dementia? Like, was he recognizing me or not? He hasn't called me by name in 10 years. Does that mean he recognizes me and doesn't say anything because he's quiet? Or is he recognizing me and keeping that to himself? It's an interesting, it's such a difficult question for those of us who have dementia in our families.
Yes. There's so many ethical issues.
That's kind of yeah, exactly. And that's kind of the piece I'm really struggling with right now. Like how to articulate where the tipping point is.
Have you thought about doing a dementia specific directives? Because they do make advanced directives for that.
I have one of those.
Yeah.
But I haven't signed it yet.
I think it's very personal. I really do. Yeah. And I think it's related to your experience and, of course, whatever health history exists in someone's family. But I think it's one of those decisions that it just has to be personal. You just have to, someone has to make that decision for themselves.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. That's a good point.
Some people just do not want to be a burden to people they care about or to the system or period.
Right.
And I think if you don't want to be a burden, you need to put that in writing and you need to articulate what's going to happen. Otherwise, you get caught up in it and you might end up in a memory care facility and,
Yeah, my mother-in-law has said that she would like to stay at home. She said, but if she got to the point where she didn't know any of the family, we could do whatever we needed to take care of her.
Yeah.
Which is very generous. Obviously, that's all about us. That's an unselfish thing.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. Very much honoring who we are as her family and would, as her caregivers. She said that probably 10 years ago, and we probably need to revisit that conversation since my father-in-law passed away a couple of years ago from complications from end-stage Alzheimer's. She may feel differently.
That's a really good point. Yeah, that's a really good point to revisit it.
Yeah.
Yeah. We recommend every year or two revisit all of it because you do change your mind.
Yeah. And you should.
And you do feel differently.
Yeah, I think that's very normal. And what are the milestones they say when you, like your spokesperson changes, you have a change in your health status. I would recommend if you have a change in where you live or if you have a change in your insurance, because all of those things matter, or if you have a change in your medical provider. If your physician changes, maybe you've had a doctor who you have had for 25 years and he retires out, then you need to look at your advanced directives and have another conversation. See if it's still accurate to who you are and if you've had a change in your health history.
Yeah. And I'd say if you listen to the Heart of Hospice podcast and you learn something new, go back to your paperwork.
I like that. Or if you've listened to Peaceful Exit and she's talked about a dementia-specific directive, then maybe decide if that's something that you feel is applicable to your life and you should have that conversation with your family. Lots to learn.
You're inspiring me. I'm going to go to my siblings and see what they're going to do.
Oh, my gosh. I have 2 siblings, and we are the caregiving unit for my mom. And we have a lot of conversations about my mom, a lot. My mom is sort of the center of everything these days. But we do not have conversations about our stuff.
There's an opening there.
There is.
Yeah. My dad's 91, so we're having lots of conversations about him. And my husband's family is having lots of conversations about my mother-in-law. Those are the 2 left in our world. We just moved my mother-in-law out of a home she lived in for 53 years.
Oh, wow.
So that's a whole nother conversation.
Oh, I'm telling you, that's a whole nother interview because that is a major,
That's a
major
major deal. And two of her caregivers actually stole from her, which was really heartbreaking. Right before she moved out of her home, she's in a wheelchair and she's very vulnerable. So that was tragic.
We should do another show about that.
Yeah,
We should.
yeah.
Okay, Sarah Cavenaugh, you're awesome. How can my listeners connect with you, find the podcast, and find out about the courses that you have?
You can find the Peaceful Exit podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts, and transcripts are on my website at peacefulexit.net. And I'd love to connect with you on social media. I'm at A Peaceful Exit. There's a little A in front of the Peaceful Exit. Mostly on LinkedIn and Instagram. And love to have followers on those platforms because, as I said early in this interview, my social media is limited, but enthusiastic.
Perfect. And I will have links in the show notes to all of your socials and to your website. Sarah, thank you so much for such a wonderful, wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much. And I really hope we get to meet in 3 dimensions someday. I would love that.
Be sure to catch the next episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast. You can find more episodes on theheartofhospice.com. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. You can connect with the Heart of Hospice on Facebook and Instagram and send your questions or comments by email to helen@theheartofhospice.com. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.